Krishna, the statesman behind the Mahabharata. Act 1, The Cradle of Revolution and the Western Ocean. Prologue, The World of the Gangetic Plain. Long before the dust settled over the battlefield of Kurukshetra, the northern plains of the Indian subcontinent were a complex, volatile mosaic of competing powers. This was the era of the Mahajanapadas, 16 great realms in the throes of a profound political transformation. Ancient tribal assemblies were giving way to centralized monarchies, imperial ambitions were clashing with republican traditions, and across the fertile valleys of the Indus and the Ganges, power was fluid, unstable, and ruthlessly pursued. In the popular imagination, shaped by centuries of devotional literature, the story of Krishna is often remembered as a divine spectacle. In the Puranic traditions that flourished long after the epic events took place, he is celebrated as an incarnation of the Supreme Preserver, a figure of cosmic play, miraculous interventions, and transcendent grace. Yet, within the primary layers of the Mahabharata, the great epic that stands as the foundational document of his legacy, another portrait emerges. Beneath the halo of divinity lies the mind of a master politician. Here is a diplomat navigating a fractured continent, a strategist managing unruly clan confederations, an architect of grand alliances, and a statesman who understood that true power rarely relies on brute force alone. To understand Krishna not merely as an object of veneration, but as an active participant in history, one must look closely at the political reality of his era. He was born into a society reaching a breaking point. The traditional codes of governance were failing, hereditary monarchies were turning autocratic, and the old order was incapable of preventing catastrophic conflict. The central problem of Krishna's life was not simply how to defeat evil, but how to construct a sustainable political architecture in a world consumed by unchecked ambition, fragile pride, and systemic decay. The Shattered Cradle. To comprehend the political mind of Krishna, one must begin with the peculiar political structure of his people, the Yadavas. Unlike the imperial monarchies of Hastinapura or Magadha, where political authority was concentrated in a single hereditary ruler, the Yadavas were an alliance of distinct clans, most notably the Vrishnis, the Andakas, and the Bhojas. They operated not as a kingdom, but as an oligarchic republic, known in ancient texts as a Sangha or Ghana. Power was distributed among clan chieftains and elders who sat in a central deliberative council known as the Sudama Assembly. Decisions required debate, consensus, and constant internal diplomacy. This republican structure was both the salvation and the systemic vulnerability of the Yadava world. It protected them from the tyranny of a single despot, but it left them deeply susceptible to internal factionalism, ego-driven squabbles, and external manipulation. The elders often valued clan pride over strategic unity, making cohesive foreign policy nearly impossible. It was into this fragile political environment that Kamsa, an ambitious prince of the Boha clan, executed a violent coup in the city of Mathura. Kamsa dismantled the council system, imprisoned his own father Ugrasena, and declared himself supreme autocrat. To secure his illegitimate rule, Kamsa forged an alliance with the most dangerous imperial power of the day, Jarasandha, the ruler of Magadha. Jarasandha was an ambitious imperialist who sought to subjugate the independent realms of northern India under a single, central authority. By backing Kamsa in Mathura, Magadha effectively established a client state on its western frontier, placing a chokehold on the independent Yadava clans and threatening the entire republican belt of Aryavata. The overthrow and execution of Kamsa by the young Krishna was far more than a personal family feud or a simple moral victory. In strict political terms, it was a republican counter-revolution. By eliminating Kamsa and restoring the elder Ugrasena to the council chair, Krishna dismantled an autocratic puppet regime and restored the Yadava Republic. He proved at an early age that he understood the value of institutional governance over autocratic dominance, refusing the crown for himself and re-establishing the authority of the council. However, every political act generates consequences. The death of Kamsa brought the full weight of Magadha's anger down upon Mathura. Jarasandha viewed the destruction of his puppet ruler as an intolerable challenge to his regional hegemony. What followed was an asymmetric struggle that would test the strategic limits of the Yadava clans and force Krishna to rethink the very nature of territorial defense and national security. The Western Ocean. In the years following the restoration of the Yadava Council, Jarasandha launched a relentless sequence of military campaigns against Mathura. Time and again, the massive armies of Magadha marched across the Gangetic plain to besiege the Yadava capital, bringing siege engines, vassal contingents, and overwhelming manpower. The Yadavas were fierce warriors, and under Krishna's leadership, they successfully defended their walls through repeated sieges. But Krishna grasped a fundamental strategic principle that escaped many of his martial contemporaries: military victory does not guarantee strategic success. Mathura sat exposed on the open plains of the Yamuna River. It lacked natural geographic defenses against a rival possessed of superior numbers and virtually limitless material resources. With every siege, the Yadava economy was drained, fields were burned, trade routes were severed, and precious human lives were lost. Even if the Yadavas won every individual battle, they were losing the long-term war of economic and demographic attrition. Magadha could afford to rebuild its armies indefinitely, the Yadava Republic could not. Faced with this existential reality, Krishna proposed a decision that shocked the traditional warrior elite: voluntary, complete evacuation. He urged the council to abandon their ancestral homeland of Mathura and migrate hundreds of miles west, across the arid deserts of Rajasthan, to the coastal peninsula of Ananta on the edge of the Arabian Sea. To the traditional Kshatriya code of ancient India, abandoning one's native soil was regarded as an indelible dishonor. A king was expected to stand and die on his land, regardless of the cost. Krishna's critics condemned the move, bestowing upon him the mocking epithet Ranchod, he who flees the battlefield. Yet Krishna prioritized the long-term survival of his people over the hollow vanity of martial pride. He understood that land without people is worthless, and that honor without survival is an illusion. He recognized that true statecraft requires the flexibility to yield ground in order to secure a vastly superior strategic position. The relocation to Dwarka was a strategic stroke of the highest order. Built on the western coast, Dwarka was protected by formidable mountain passes, expansive deserts, and sea walls that rendered large-scale land invasions from the east logistically impossible. Furthermore, the move fundamentally transformed the Yadava economy. Situated on the coastline, Dwarka evolved into a thriving maritime power, controlling lucrative trade routes connecting India to the Persian Gulf, East Africa, and beyond. This political environment also explains why the distinction between a kingdom and a clan republic mattered so much. In a hereditary monarchy, a ruler could often impose a decision through the machinery of the court. In a confederation, however, political authority depended upon persuading multiple interests that a course of action served their collective survival. Krishna therefore developed his influence not simply by commanding, but by persuading. He had to make strategic arguments intelligible to elders whose loyalties were local, to warriors whose honor was personal, and to merchants whose prosperity depended upon stable roots. His political skill lay partly in translating a large strategic problem into terms that different groups could accept. The confrontation with Kamsa was consequently only the first stage of a much larger transformation. Restoring Ugrasena did not automatically restore the old political equilibrium. The Yadavas still had to coexist with powerful monarchies, manage rival clans, protect commercial interests, and prevent another ambitious leader from capturing the institutions of the Confederation. Krishna's experience therefore taught him an enduring lesson: removing a ruler is easier than repairing the political system that allowed that ruler to gain power in the first place. His later decision to relocate the population can be viewed through the same institutional lens. A military commander might have considered retreat a temporary battlefield maneuver. Krishna treated migration as a strategic redesign of the state itself. Population, economic resources, defensive geography, trade, and political independence had to be considered together. The move west was therefore not merely an escape from Jarasandha. It was an attempt to create a political environment in which the Yadavas could survive on their own terms and where their future would not be permanently determined by the military ambitions of Magadha. The broader lesson of this first phase is that political geography can be as important as military strength. Krishna did not defeat every threat by destroying the threatening power. Sometimes he changed the conditions under which that power could operate. The westward migration was the clearest example. Instead of allowing Magadha to determine the location and tempo of every confrontation, he moved the Yadavas to a position where their own geography, economy, and institutions worked in their favor. This principle would remain central to Krishna's later statecraft. Security was never an end in itself, it was the foundation that allowed a political community to retain freedom of action. By preserving that freedom, Krishna ensured that the Yadavas could participate in the wider politics of the subcontinent rather than becoming permanent subjects of a stronger empire. The deeper significance of this decision was that Krishna treated survival as a political objective in its own right. A state exists to preserve a community, not merely to defend a particular piece of territory. Once that principle was accepted, retreat could become a rational instrument of sovereignty rather than an admission of defeat. This distinction would shape Krishna's later approach to every major crisis. By stepping back from the regional power struggles of the Gangetic plain, Krishna preserved the population, wealth, and independence of his clan. He had neutralized the threat of Magadha without sacrificing his army in a senseless war of attrition. Dwarka became an impregnable fortress, a sovereign maritime sanctuary that provided Krishna with an independent, secure base of operations from which he could shape the grand geopolitics of the entire subcontinent. The significance of this transformation extended beyond the immediate safety of the Yadavas. By choosing survival over symbolic resistance, Krishna demonstrated that a state could preserve its sovereignty without allowing its enemies to dictate the terms of engagement. The migration also changed the strategic geography of the Yadava Confederation. Instead of remaining trapped between stronger inland powers, they acquired a defensible western base and a new economic orientation. This was a recurring feature of Krishna's political thinking. When direct confrontation was unfavorable, he searched for a different arena in which the balance of power could be redesigned. Act 2. Grand Alliances and the Imperial Calculus. The Tripartite Axis. With Dwarka secure, prosperous, and economically self-sufficient, Krishna turned his attention back to the broader geopolitical landscape of Aryavata. The undisputed focal point of power in the north remained the Kuru kingdom, centered at the legendary city of Hastinapura. Yet Hastinapura was deeply unstable, crippled by an internal crisis of succession. The reigning monarch, Dhritarashtra, was blind both physically and politically, torn between his official duty to the state and his obsessive, permissive love for his eldest son, Duryodhana. Standing against Duryodhana were his cousins, the 5 Pandava brothers, Yudhishthira, Bhima, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadeva. The Pandavas possessed a legitimate claim to the throne, superior martial training, and widespread popularity among the citizenry. Krishna recognized that this internal family rift would eventually determine the political future of the continent. He saw in the Pandavas, particularly in Arjuna, not merely relatives through his aunt Kunti, but leaders capable of establishing a governance model built on law, equity, and institutional stability rather than personal autocracy. He realized that if Duryodhana secured absolute power, Hastinapura would align with autocratic regimes across India, crushing republican independent states like Dwarka. Krishna's alignment with the Pandavas was forged through a series of calculated political maneuvers. When Arjuna won the hand of Princess Draupadi at the Swayamvara in Panchala, Krishna immediately recognized the immense geopolitical weight of the event. Panchala was an elite military power led by King Drupada, possessing a disciplined standing army. By helping secure the alliance between the Pandavas and Panchala, Krishna created a powerful counterweight to the dominance of Hastinapura. When the Kuru court attempted to resolve the succession conflict by partitioning the realm, gifting the Pandavas the barren, undeveloped wilderness of Kandavaprastha, Krishna guided the brothers in transforming this wasteland into a magnificent capital, Indraprastha. Under his influence, Indraprastha was built with advanced fortifications, wide thoroughfares, and welcoming laws for merchants and scholars. It became a flourishing hub of trade, culture, and constitutional governance, establishing the Pandavas as sovereign rulers in their own right, entirely independent of Hastinapura's oversight. This was not an alliance based merely on sentimental affection, it was a carefully constructed political tripartite axis. By linking the maritime wealth and naval security of Dwarka, the infantry strength and archery of Panchala, and the moral legitimacy and martial skill of the Pandavas, Krishna created a coalition capable of rebalancing the entire geopolitical map of ancient India. The imperial calculus. With Indraprastha established as a major power, Prince Yudhishthira sought to formalize his status by performing the Rajasuya Yajna, the grand imperial sacrifice that would declare him paramount ruler among kings and consolidate the fragmented realms under a single umbrella of law. Krishna supported this ambition, but he raised a critical strategic objection: imperial authority could not be claimed while Jarasandha of Magadha remained unchecked. Jarasandha had captured and imprisoned over 80 sovereign kings in his mountain fortress of Girivraja, intending to execute them in a dark ritual of supreme power. So long as Magadha held this terrifying leverage over the regional rulers, Yudhishthira's claim to emperor status would remain a meaningless title. Yet, initiating a full-scale military invasion of Magadha was out of the question. Magadha's capital was fortified by 5 natural mountain walls and guarded by massive armies. An open invasion would cost tens of thousands of lives, drain the treasury, stall in a prolonged siege, and leave the entire continent vulnerable to secondary conflicts. Instead, Krishna planned a precise, low-casualty surgical intervention. Disguised as unpretentious ascetics, Krishna, Bhima, and Arjuna slipped undetected into Jarasandha's capital. Utilizing the sacred rules of hospitality and religious custom that bound ancient rulers, Krishna secured an audience with the king and forced him into granting a request. Once inside the private court, Krishna removed his disguise and challenged Jarasandha to single combat, offering him the choice of opponent. Jarasandha, unwilling to lose face before his court, chose Bhima. For 14 days, the two men wrestled in continuous, brutal single combat. When Bhima struggled to overcome his opponent's incredible physical endurance, Krishna silently signaled the key to victory, picking up a small twig, splitting it down the middle, and throwing the two halves in opposite directions, instructing Bhima on how to overcome Jarasandha's unique physiology. The death of Jarasandha brought an immediate end to Magadha's imperial threat without destroying its cities or slaughtering its civilian population. Crucially, Krishna did not annex Magadha or place a Yadava governor on its throne. Instead, he crowned Jarasandha's son, Sahadeva, as the new king and immediately liberated all 80 captive monarchs. By restoring these kings to their thrones with honor, Krishna turned former victims of Magadha into deeply indebted, loyal allies of the Pandava coalition. Yet, political challenges remained within the coalition itself. During the grand Rajasuya ceremony at Indraprastha, Shishupala, the king of Kedi, launched a bitter, public verbal assault against Krishna. Shishupala represented a conservative, autocratic faction among the regional nobility that deeply resented Krishna's growing influence, his republican roots, and his non-traditional political methods. Krishna endured a barrage of insults, maintaining composure to honor a personal promise made long ago to Shishupala's mother to forgive his first 100 offenses. But the moment the 100th insult was uttered, crossing the line of diplomatic tolerance, Krishna responded with decisive, lethal force, executing Shishupala with his sharp discus before the assembled court. The episode also revealed an important feature of Krishna's method: he rarely sought power for himself when an institution could serve the same purpose more effectively. After Jarasanda's death, the temptation to absorb Magadha into the growing coalition would have been enormous. Instead, Krishna restored a local ruler and converted a former enemy structure into a source of stability. This reduced the administrative burden of conquest while creating political goodwill among rulers who had feared Magadha. The objective was therefore not territorial expansion for its own sake, but the construction of a balance in which no single power could again dominate the entire political system. In that sense, Krishna's diplomacy was cumulative. Each settlement created another layer of legitimacy, another relationship, and another barrier against unchecked imperial power. This was also why the Rajasuya mattered beyond ceremony. It was an attempt to turn a collection of bilateral friendships into a recognized political order. Every ruler who accepted Yudhishthira's authority became part of a wider network, while Krishna's intervention against Jarasandha removed the most obvious obstacle to that network. Cooperation increasingly offered a safer alternative to submission under a dominant imperial power. The emerging coalition did not eliminate competition, but it changed the incentives of the competing states. Cooperation with the Pandavas increasingly offered a safer alternative to submission under a dominant imperial power. The alliance system also demonstrates that Krishna understood power as something that could be multiplied through coordination. No individual member of the coalition needed to dominate the entire continent. Dwarka supplied security and maritime access, Panchala contributed military strength and political legitimacy, the Pandavas brought a claim to lawful sovereignty and a growing network of relationships. Each component compensated for the weaknesses of the others. This was effectively a system of distributed power, in which strategic value came from combination rather than absolute superiority by any single state. That logic became especially visible in the treatment of defeated enemies. Krishna did not assume that every defeated ruler had to become a permanent enemy. The restoration of Sahadeva and the liberation of the captive kings converted a military victory into a diplomatic resource. Formerly independent rulers were given a reason to prefer the new political arrangement to the old one. Such decisions reduced the probability that victory would generate an endless cycle of rebellions and reprisals. They also gave the Pandava coalition something more valuable than territory: legitimacy. The Rajasuya therefore represented the culmination of several carefully connected moves. The Pandavas had survived exile and persecution, established a prosperous capital, developed relationships with powerful allies, and removed the most formidable obstacle to recognition of their authority. Krishna's contribution was rarely visible as conventional conquest because his influence operated through sequencing. One political decision created the conditions for the next. A local settlement became an alliance became a coalition, the coalition became a recognized political order. But this architecture remained vulnerable to personality and ambition. The hostility of Shishupala demonstrated that not every ruler would accept the new balance. Krishna's response was severe because he understood that political systems depend not only on agreements but also on credible limits. If every public challenge to the authority of the assembly could be tolerated indefinitely, the coalition could gradually lose its ability to make collective decisions. His willingness to enforce a boundary therefore complemented his preference for diplomacy. Negotiation was valuable precisely because the participants knew that some boundaries were real. This was the essence of Krishna's coalition building. He was creating interdependence without demanding uniformity. Different rulers could retain their identities while recognizing that their survival was connected. Such a system was more resilient than an empire held together only by fear, because its members had a practical reason to preserve the arrangement. This balance between independence and cooperation became one of the defining features of Krishna's political method. He did not seek to erase the individuality of allied rulers or transform every partner into a subordinate. Instead, he tried to make their interests overlap. When interests overlap, cooperation can continue even when personal affection disappears. That was especially important in a continent where alliances could shift rapidly and where a single ruler's ambition could destabilize an entire region. Krishna's answer was to make stability itself a shared interest. That shared interest was more durable than personal loyalty because it tied political survival to cooperation itself. It also reduced the temptation for smaller states to stand alone when confronted by a dominant power. This made the coalition stronger because cooperation became a rational choice for every participant. The strength of such a system lay precisely in its flexibility. It could survive differences of culture, ambition, and local interest because cooperation did not require surrendering sovereignty. Krishna was effectively constructing a network rather than a centralized empire, and networks can remain resilient when their members see continued value in belonging to them. The alliance was therefore more than a friendship between powerful families. It was an attempt to create a political equilibrium in which several centers of power could restrain one another. Krishna's genius lay in recognizing that balance did not require every partner to be equally strong, it required each partner to possess something the others needed. That made cooperation strategically valuable and politically durable. This execution was a clear political message. It demonstrated to every monarch present that while Krishna preferred diplomacy, consensus, and peace, he would not allow internal subversion, open insults to the assembly, or public lawlessness to derail the fragile stability of the newly unified realm. Act 3: The Descent and the Embassy of Peace. The descent into war. The political stability achieved through the Rajasuya was dramatically shattered from within. Driven by envy of Indraprastha's wealth and haunted by personal insecurity, Duryodhana manipulated Yudhishthira into a rigged game of dice at Hastinapura. Exploiting Yudhishthira's adherence to Kshatriya codes of honor, which forbade declining a challenge to play, Duryodhana and his uncle Shakuni stripped the Pandavas of their kingdom, their wealth, their personal freedom, and finally the honor of their common wife, Draupadi. The Pandavas were condemned to 13 years of exile, 12 years wandering in the forest and a final year living in complete concealment. Krishna was absent from Hastinapura during the dice game, occupied with defending Dwarka against a surprise amphibious invasion by King Sulva, a detail that highlights the constant, demanding nature of his own regional security responsibilities. When he finally reunited with the Pandavas in the forest, he found their political gains erased, their coalition fractured, and their lives ruined. When the 13 years of exile finally concluded, the Pandavas fulfilled every condition of their punishment and formally requested the restoration of their sovereign territory. But Duryodhana, backed by the vast military power of Hastinapura and protected by formidable commanders like Bhishma, Drona, and Karna, refused to honor the original agreement. He declared that he would not grant the Pandavas enough land to cover the point of a needle. As northern India rapidly mobilized for war, both factions sought to secure alliances across the continent. Every major realm was forced to choose a side. The supreme importance of Krishna's support became apparent when both Duryodhana and Arjuna arrived in Dwarka on the very same morning, seeking his personal allegiance. The meeting in Krishna's bedchamber presents a profound study in contrasting political mindsets. Duryodhana, arriving first, walked in proudly and took a seat at the head of Krishna's bed. Arjuna, entering second, stood humbly at the foot of the bed with folded hands. When Krishna awoke, his eyes fell first upon Arjuna. Acknowledging both princes, Krishna offered them a choice. On one side stood his entire elite military force, the Narayani Sena, numbering hundreds of thousands of fully equipped, battle-hardened soldiers. On the other side stood Krishna himself, completely unarmed, pledged not to fight, serving purely as an advisor. Because he had seen Arjuna first, Krishna granted him the first choice. Without a moment's hesitation, Arjuna chose Krishna alone. Duryodhana, delighted by what he perceived as Arjuna's foolish emotionalism, eagerly claimed the vast army of the Narayani Sena. This choice laid bare the philosophical divide between the two sides. Duryodhana evaluated political and military power strictly in terms of material metrics, numbers, weapons, and sheer physical force. Arjuna understood that material force without strategic direction, moral clarity, and high-level intellect is ultimately useless. In selecting Krishna, Arjuna chose the ultimate mind over the ultimate army. The envoy of peace. Even as armies assembled on the plains of Kurukshetra, Krishna made one final, deliberate effort to prevent a catastrophic war. He undertook a high-stakes diplomatic mission, traveling directly to Hastinapura as an official envoy for the Pandavas. This peace mission was a masterclass in calculated statecraft. Krishna's objectives were twofold: first, to exhaust every possible avenue for peace so that the moral burden of a destructive war would rest entirely upon Duryodhana, and second, to test the internal unity of the Kuru court. To demonstrate the Pandavas' desire to avoid bloodshed, Krishna dramatically reduced their demands. He did not insist on the return of the entire empire, nor even half the kingdom. He asked merely for 5 simple villages, one for each brother, so they could fulfill their duties as rulers without provoking a ruinous continent-wide war. Upon arriving in Hastinapura, Krishna made a deliberate political statement. He rejected Duryodhana's grand hospitality and refused to stay in the royal palace. Instead, he took lodging in the humble dwelling of Vidura, the wise minister born of a maidservant. By doing so, Krishna signaled that he could not be bought with luxury, nor would he grant diplomatic cover to a corrupt regime. When Krishna addressed the assembled Kuru court, his speech was a tour de force of realistic diplomacy. He spoke not merely of abstract righteousness, but of self-preservation and economic reality. He pointed out that a war between cousins would decimate the ruling class, leave the realm vulnerable to external enemies, destroy agricultural productivity, and bring ruin to the entire population. He presented peace not as a surrender, but as the only logical decision for the survival of the dynasty. The elders of the court, Bhishma, Drona, and Vidura, implored Duryodhana to accept the terms. But Duryodhana remained arrogant, paranoid, and unyielding. Blinded by pride, he ordered his guards to commit an unprecedented violation of diplomatic law, to arrest and chain the royal envoy. Krishna did not panic. Instead, he responded with a display of absolute dominance, revealing his Vishwarupa, his cosmic, uncontainable form, within the court assembly. To a secular analyst of statecraft, this dramatic manifestation served an unmistakable psychological purpose. It was a projection of overwhelming strength. Krishna proved to every general and king in that hall that his desire for peace was not born of weakness, but of deliberate self-control. He demonstrated that he was a force far beyond their ability to contain, coerce, or intimidate. Before departing Hastinapura, Krishna executed one final, confidential diplomatic maneuver. He invited Karna, Duryodhana's premier warrior and closest confidant, into his chariot for a private drive outside the city walls. Krishna revealed to Karna the hidden secret of his origin, that he was actually the eldest son of Kunti, born before her marriage to Pandu, making him the rightful eldest brother of the Pandavas. Krishna offered Karna the ultimate prize: if he changed sides, the Pandavas would bow before him, Yudhishthira would carry his sandals, Draupadi would accept him, and Karna would be crowned supreme emperor of Aryavata. It was a brilliant attempt to disarm Duryodhana's primary military strength. Yet Karna, bound by personal gratitude, deep loyalty to Duryodhana, and pride in his outcast identity, declined the offer. Though Karna refused to switch allegiance, Krishna's revelation shattered Karna's inner psychological certainty, planting seeds of doubt and identity crisis that would weaken his resolve when the final crisis arrived. The significance of Krishna's choice was therefore larger than the personal preference of one warrior. By choosing the unarmed statesman, Arjuna effectively placed strategic intelligence above numerical superiority. Krishna could read the political situation, anticipate the consequences of decisions, and advise when conventional battlefield instincts became dangerous. Duryodhana, meanwhile, possessed an enormous army but had chosen to measure security in terms of force alone. The contrast would become increasingly important once the war began, because the Pandavas were not merely confronting a larger military formation, they were confronting a coalition of experienced commanders whose strengths had to be neutralized one by one. Krishna's role would be to identify those weaknesses and convert them into opportunities before the Pandavas were overwhelmed. His peace effort also protected the Pandavas from a different danger, appearing eager for war. If the conflict eventually became unavoidable, their political legitimacy would depend upon demonstrating that they had exhausted reasonable alternatives. By asking for only 5 villages, Krishna reduced the dispute to its essential question: was Duryodhana willing to permit even a minimal political settlement, or did he require complete domination? His refusal supplied the answer. The choice made in Dwarka also reveals why Krishna's conception of leadership differed from the conventional image of a warrior king. He did not need the appearance of personal invincibility. His power came partly from being willing to give away something valuable when doing so produced a greater strategic return. By offering his army while retaining his own political intelligence and advisory role, he created a situation in which both sides received what they believed they wanted. Duryodhana gained numbers. Arjuna gained Krishna. Only later would the deeper value of the two choices become clear. This episode also demonstrates the importance of perception in politics. Duryodhana's mistake was not simply choosing the army, it was revealing how he understood power. He believed that visible resources were the most reliable measure of strength. Krishna understood that resources become useful only when they are organized around a coherent objective. An army without political direction can fight brilliantly and still serve a disastrous cause. A smaller coalition with better coordination can sometimes achieve more with fewer resources. The peace embassy continued this same pattern. Krishna was not merely attempting to persuade Duryodhana to become virtuous. He was testing whether a political compromise was still possible. By reducing the Pandavas' demand from their former kingdom to 5 villages, he stripped away every convenient excuse. The request was deliberately modest. If Duryodhana rejected even that, the responsibility for escalation would become unmistakable. The embassy also served as intelligence gathering. Krishna could observe the behavior of the Kuru court, assess the positions of Bhishma and Drona, understand the degree of Duryodhana's isolation, and determine whether any internal pressure could change the decision. Diplomacy was therefore simultaneously negotiation, signaling, and reconnaissance. A statesman does not enter an enemy court merely to speak, he enters to learn. His conversation with Karna extended that strategy beyond the formal court. Krishna recognized that wars are often decided before armies meet because individual relationships shape the willingness of commanders to fight. Karna was one of Duryodhana's most important assets, not merely because of his martial ability but because his loyalty strengthened Duryodhana psychologically. Offering Karna a place among the Pandavas was therefore an attempt to alter the political structure of the opposing camp without a battle. When Karna refused, Krishna had learned something equally valuable: the loyalty of Duryodhana's principal champion was stronger than the promise of rank, legitimacy, and power. The decision made the coming war more certain, but it also clarified the forces that would have to be confronted. The decision also demonstrates that Krishna understood the difference between winning a contest and shaping its consequences. A battlefield victory could remove an opponent for a day. Political settlement could change the behavior of an entire generation of rulers. His preference for the second whenever possible explains why diplomacy remained central to his strategy even when war appeared increasingly inevitable. Krishna's diplomacy also demonstrated the value of exhausting peaceful alternatives before accepting the logic of war. A settlement that failed could still produce information, expose intentions, and strengthen the legitimacy of the side that had offered it. Peace efforts were therefore not wasted simply because they did not produce peace. They could alter the political environment in which the eventual conflict would be judged. Diplomacy had failed, but Krishna had accomplished his strategic goal. He had isolated Duryodhana morally, unified his own coalition, exposed the weakness of the Kuru leadership, and ensured that history would view the Pandavas as reluctant warriors forced into a defensive conflict. Act 4. The Battlefield and the Realpolitik of War. The charioteer's imperative. When the vast armies finally confronted each other at Kurukshetra, Krishna took up his position not as a commanding general wielding weapons, but as the charioteer for Arjuna. In the combat dynamics of the ancient world, the charioteer was far more than a driver. Situated at the dynamic center of the fighting, the charioteer controlled movement, monitored tactical shifts, shielded the archer's vulnerable angles, and served as a real-time tactical advisor. By serving as charioteer, Krishna positioned himself at the absolute point of operational control while adhering strictly to his pledge of non-combatancy. Yet, at the precise moment the conch shells blew to signal the start of slaughter, Arjuna suffered a complete psychological breakdown. Surveying the enemy lines, he saw his grandfather Bhishma, his teacher Drona, his cousins, and his lifelong friends lined up for mutual destruction. Overwhelmed by grief, moral vertigo, and guilt, Arjuna dropped his bow and sat down in the chariot, declaring that he would rather live as a penniless beggar than kill his own family for a throne covered in blood. It is at this moment of total operational crisis that Krishna delivers the profound discourse recorded as the Bhagavad Gita. While the Gita contains immense metaphysical and spiritual depth, its primary political and operational role within the narrative is immediate. It is designed to overcome existential paralysis and restore a leader's will to act in a time of supreme crisis. Krishna addresses Arjuna's collapse not by dismissing his moral grief, but by expanding his perspective beyond personal emotion. He argues that Arjuna is viewing a massive historical and structural crisis through the narrow, selfish lens of personal attachment. He explains that in a complex society, inaction is itself a choice that carries catastrophic consequences. To refuse to fight a necessary war against a corrupt regime is not an act of moral purity, it is an act of complicity that allows tyranny to flourish unchecked. Krishna introduces the imperative of Svadharma, the specific duty assigned to an individual based on their role in society. As a prince and a defender of the social contract, Arjuna's duty is to combat systemic injustice and restore public order, regardless of personal emotional pain or familial ties. The Gita transforms Arjuna from a paralyzed, grief-stricken individual into an focused agent of historical restoration. Krishna successfully aligns Arjuna's personal conscience with his larger political responsibility, giving him the mental fortitude to face the agonizing task ahead. The Realpolitik of Kurukshetra. The War of Kurukshetra raged for 18 devastating days. As the fighting deepened, it became clear that traditional military tactics would not yield victory for the Pandavas. The Kuru army was led by legendary figures who possessed unmatched martial skill, divine weaponry, and ironclad vows that made them virtually invincible in fair combat. It is during these 18 days that Krishna's strategic intervention becomes most controversial. Time and again, when the Pandavas faced total defeat at the hands of invincible opponents, Krishna advised moves that directly violated the established codes of noble warfare, Dharma Yuddha. When the Grand Patriarch Bhishma was decimating the Pandava lines day after day, killing thousands of soldiers, Krishna advised Arjuna to place Shikhandi, a warrior whom Bhishma refused to fight due to his personal vows, at the front of his chariot, using him as a human shield to disarm the Patriarch and cut him down. When Drona was destroying the Pandava army with unstoppable divine weapons, Krishna orchestrated a psychological deception. He encouraged the spread of a half-truth, announcing that Ashwatthama is dead, referring to an elephant of that name, knowing it would cause Drona to believe his beloved son had died. When Drona dropped his weapons in grief to enter deep meditation, he was executed on the spot. When Jayadratha had to be killed before sunset to fulfill Arjuna's desperate vow, Krishna used atmospheric conditions to obscure the sun, creating the illusion of nightfall. When Jayadratha let down his guard to celebrate, Krishna urged Arjuna to strike immediately. When Karna's chariot sank into the mud and he stepped down to free it unarmed, appealing to the rules of chivalry, Krishna reminded Arjuna of the unchivalrous atrocities Karna had supported, most notably the brutal, collective murder of Arjuna's young son, Abhimanyu. He ordered Arjuna to shoot the disarmed warrior where he stood. And in the final duel between Bhima and Duryodhana, when Bhima could not break Duryodhana's armored defense, Krishna subtly tapped his own thigh, signaling Bhima to strike Duryodhana below the belt, a direct violation of the rules of mace combat. To understand these decisions, one must examine the governing framework of Krishna's political thought, the concept of apad dharma, the rules of conduct during an existential crisis. Krishna operated on the principle that rules of combat are valid only when both sides respect them. When one side consistently uses lawlessness to seize power, demanding that the other side adhere strictly to chivalry is not moral righteousness, it is strategic suicide. Krishna maintained a clear distinction between two levels of morality. Micro-dharma represents the procedural rules governing individual conduct, the formal laws of war, such as not striking a disarmed opponent or fighting only after sunrise. This approach makes Krishna's conduct during the war difficult to classify in conventional moral categories. He was not simply advocating victory at any cost, because he repeatedly sought to preserve the larger political and social order. Nor was he a conventional military commander, because he remained formally outside the fighting. His influence operated through timing, information, psychological insight, and an understanding of the personalities confronting the Pandavas. He recognized that every battlefield had a human dimension, vows could become vulnerabilities, pride could become predictable behavior, and loyalty could be manipulated by expectations of honor. In this environment, the decisive weapon was sometimes not a sword or an arrow, but the ability to understand what an opponent would do when placed under pressure. Krishna repeatedly exploited that human dimension to compensate for the Pandavas' military disadvantages. The distinction between these two levels of morality is central to understanding why Krishna's methods remain so unsettling. His actions invite admiration from those who value strategic realism, but they also force the uncomfortable question of whether exceptional circumstances can justify exceptional conduct. The epic does not make that question easy. Victory brings no clean moral triumph, because the Pandavas themselves emerge wounded by what they had to do. Krishna's strategy succeeds, but its success carries a permanent ethical cost. That tension is precisely what makes his political role more complex than the image of a flawless military advisor. It leaves the audience with a dilemma rather than a simple verdict. Macro-dharma represents the overarching moral order, stability, and justice of human society as a whole. The battlefield therefore became an extension of the political calculations that had preceded it. Krishna understood that the Pandavas could not simply imitate the Kuru army. They were facing commanders with decades of experience, powerful weapons, personal vows, and immense prestige. A symmetrical contest would favor the larger and more experienced force. The Pandavas needed to change the terms of the contest. This is why Krishna repeatedly focused on individual vulnerabilities. Bhishma's vow, Drona's attachment to his son, Jayadratha's confidence in the approaching sunset, Karna's history with the Pandavas, and Duryodhana's obsession with martial honor all became factors that could be incorporated into strategy. In modern terms, Krishna was not treating the opposing army as an anonymous mass. He was analyzing its leadership structure and identifying the psychological conditions that could disrupt it. The approach was also cumulative. Removing one commander changed the balance for the next phase of the war. Breaking a particular vow could create an opening that did not exist the day before. A successful deception could force an enemy to surrender initiative. Krishna's battlefield strategy therefore resembled political strategy: isolate the critical problem, alter the conditions surrounding it, and strike when the opponent's options have narrowed. Yet the consequences were severe. Every tactical success increased the physical devastation of the war. Krishna could secure Pandava victory, but he could not make victory clean. The destruction of respected elders and friends meant that the winning side inherited a devastated political landscape. This is an important qualification to the realpolitik interpretation. Strategic effectiveness did not erase human cost. In fact, the epic repeatedly emphasizes that the cost remained visible even after the battlefield had fallen silent. The Gita consequently occupies a unique position within this story. Before Krishna can direct Arjuna toward action, he must confront the psychological consequences of action itself. The problem is not simply that Arjuna is afraid. He understands that victory will destroy relationships that cannot be restored. Krishna's answer places individual suffering inside a larger conception of duty and historical responsibility. Whether one accepts the theological dimension or reads the dialogue philosophically, the political problem remains recognizable. Leaders must sometimes make decisions whose immediate human cost is terrible because refusing to decide can produce an even greater catastrophe. That tension gives Krishna's conduct its enduring complexity. He does not offer a world in which moral choices are painless. Instead, he presents a world in which responsibility sometimes requires choosing between competing harms. His statecraft is therefore not the pursuit of perfect outcomes, but the attempt to prevent the larger order from collapsing when every available option carries a cost. The battlefield thus became the final test of a philosophy formed over decades. Krishna had learned that institutions could fail, alliances could fracture, and conventional rules could be exploited. His response was not to abandon rules altogether, but to place them within a hierarchy of responsibilities. That hierarchy remains one of the most provocative features of the Krishna portrayed by the epic. In this sense, the war was not merely a clash between two families. It was the final breakdown of every political mechanism that had previously contained the dispute. Once negotiation, arbitration, compromise, and diplomacy had failed, the battlefield became the arena in which the competing visions of political order would be decided. This is why the battlefield episodes cannot be separated from the political story that preceded them. Krishna's tactics were shaped by the objective he had pursued from the beginning: preventing the destruction of a viable political order. The methods may remain controversial, but within the logic of the epic they were responses to an environment in which conventional restraint had already been exploited by those seeking domination. If strict adherence to procedural rules ensures the victory of a ruthless autocracy that will destroy the moral framework of society, then those procedural rules must be set aside to protect the larger human order. Krishna was willing to sacrifice his personal moral reputation, accepting the condemnation of traditionalists, to ensure that a just order survived for future generations. Act 5, the aftermath, the curse, and the enduring legacy. Puranic devotion versus epic realism. To fully grasp the political dimensions of Krishna's life, one must distinguish his character in the primary text of the Mahabharata from his portrayal in later Puranic literature and devotional movements. In the later Puranas, such as the Harivamsa, the Vishnu Purana, and the Bhagavata Purana, Krishna's childhood in Vrindavan, his pastoral romance with the gopis, and his effortless execution of miracles take center stage. In these texts, he is presented as the absolute cosmic ruler for whom human history is merely a playful, preordained theater. In contrast, the original narrative of the Mahabharata presents a far more grounded, humanly complex figure. While his divine nature is acknowledged, most notably during the revelation of the Vishwarupa, his daily life is defined by difficult political choices, fragile negotiations, strategic calculations, and profound emotional burdens. In the epic, Krishna bleeds, grieves, faces fierce internal opposition within his own clan, and confronts the frustrating limitations of human diplomacy. He does not resolve crises with a wave of his hand. He plans, negotiates, compromises, and endures the messy, painful reality of political leadership. This analytical perspective does not diminish Krishna's legacy, it reveals his true greatness. Seeing Krishna as a historical actor allows us to appreciate a mind operating within the gritty realities of human conflict, striving persistently to build a better political order out of a flawed world. The ashes of victory. The war of Kurukshetra ended in victory for the Pandavas, but it was a victory that felt remarkably like absolute ruin. The battlefield was left littered with the bodies of millions of warriors. An entire generation of leadership had been destroyed. The great cities of Aryavata were filled with mourning widows and fatherless children. The victory was celebrated not with joy, but with silent grief. In the immediate aftermath, Queen Gandhari, who had lost all 100 of her sons in the slaughter, walked across the silent battlefield. Blindfolded in lifelong solidarity with her blind husband, she confronted Krishna amidst the decaying remains of her family. In a voice filled with agony and rage, Gandhari placed the ultimate blame for the tragedy upon Krishna. She declared that as a figure of wisdom, power, and influence, he had possessed the capacity to stop the war, yet he had allowed the continent to tear itself apart. By the power of her grief, she pronounced a curse. 36 years from that day, Krishna's own Yadava clan would turn upon itself in violent civil conflict and perish. And Krishna himself would die alone in the wilderness, brought down by a lowly hunter. Krishna received the curse not with anger or denial, but with a quiet bow. He understood that power breeds complacency, and that even the magnificent republic he had constructed in Dwarka was subject to the inescapable laws of internal decay. 36 years later, Gandhari's words came to pass with tragic clarity. Protected by their coastal fortress, wealthy from sea trade, and proud of their military reputation, the young princes of the Yadava Confederation grew arrogant, decadent, and undisciplined. Old factional rivalries resurfaced between the Vrishnis, the Andakas, and the Bhojas. During a festival on the beaches of Prabhasa, fueled by alcohol and petty insults, an argument broke out among the Yadava leaders. Words turned to violence, weapons were drawn, and within hours, the great Yadava Confederation destroyed itself in an internal massacre. The very clan that Krishna had saved from Magadha and built into a power tore itself apart from within. Shortly thereafter, a massive sea surge rose from the ocean, sweeping over the walls of Dwarka and submerging the golden city beneath the waves. The destruction of the Yadavas therefore completed a striking political paradox. Krishna had spent much of his life protecting his people from external domination, yet he could not permanently protect them from the internal forces that eventually consumed them. The same clan structures that had once provided resilience against autocracy could again become sources of rivalry when discipline and shared purpose weakened. Dwarka's wealth and security, which had once been instruments of survival, could not by themselves preserve the political community. The lesson was painfully consistent with the logic that had shaped Krishna's earlier decisions. Institutions survive only when the people within them continue to uphold the values that make those institutions work. No fortress, alliance, or military reputation can substitute for internal cohesion. Krishna's final tragedy was therefore not simply the loss of a city, but the demonstration that even a carefully constructed political order remains vulnerable to the character of the society that sustains it. His death is not presented as the triumphant retirement of a ruler who has permanently solved the problems of his age. Instead, it marks the end of a generation and the beginning of another period of uncertainty. The strategist who understood the limits of power ultimately becomes a reminder of those limits. His achievements survive as memory, philosophy, and political example, while the institutions he built pass away. Krishna walked alone into the quiet forests of Prabhasa. Lying down beneath a tree to meditate, his life's work completed and his city swallowed by the sea, he was spotted by a hunter named Jora, who mistook his exposed foot for the ear of a hidden deer. The hunter released an arrow, striking Krishna in the heel, his single vulnerable spot. The aftermath also complicates any interpretation of Krishna as a simple architect of victory. If the purpose of statecraft were merely to defeat rivals, the destruction of the Yadavas would be inexplicable. Krishna had achieved military security, economic prosperity, and political influence, yet the system eventually collapsed because its internal relationships deteriorated. The tragedy suggests that external security is only one dimension of political survival. The Yadava collapse can therefore be read as a warning about institutional complacency. A community that has survived repeated external threats may begin to believe that its strength is permanent. Wealth can weaken discipline, military prestige can encourage arrogance, factional identities can become stronger than the common identity that once united them. The very success of Dwarka could contain the seeds of its eventual decline. Security reduces immediate pressure, but reduced pressure can also reduce vigilance. This gives Gandhari's curse a deeper narrative function. Whether understood literally, symbolically, or as part of the epic's theological framework, the curse forces Krishna to confront the limits of his own power. Gandhari's accusation is devastating precisely because Krishna had been the great advocate of intervention. He had influenced rulers, built coalitions, prevented some conflicts, and guided the Pandavas through the greatest war of the age. Yet even he could not guarantee that political power would always be used wisely by those who inherited it. The final destruction of Dwarka consequently reverses the imagery of Krishna's earlier migration. In his youth, movement west represented strategic survival, a people abandoned a vulnerable homeland and created a safer one. At the end of his life, the fortified western city itself disappears. The fortress that once symbolized security becomes a reminder that no geographic defense is permanent. Political orders are temporary structures built against forces that eventually exceed them. Krishna's death completes that reversal. He does not die surrounded by armies, seated on a throne, or directing a final campaign. The statesman who had influenced kings and commanders meets death in solitude. The contrast is deliberate and powerful. Political influence can reshape history, but it cannot exempt the individual from mortality. The final image strips away the machinery of power and leaves the human figure alone with the consequences of a lifetime of decisions. Yet his political legacy survives precisely because his story does not end in uncomplicated triumph. If Krishna had simply conquered every opponent and established an eternal empire, his lesson would be narrower. Instead, the Mahabharata presents a statesman who succeeds repeatedly while remaining unable to control every consequence. His victories are real, but temporary, his compromises are necessary, but troubling, his institutions are impressive, but fragile. The enduring lesson is therefore not that strategy can solve history, but that intelligent leadership can sometimes create better possibilities within a world that remains fundamentally uncertain. The ending therefore returns the story to its beginning. Krishna had entered a world in which political systems were unstable and competing powers sought advantage through force, alliance, and manipulation. He spent his life trying to create greater stability, yet the final collapse of his own community demonstrated that stability is never permanent. The statesman can influence the direction of history, but cannot freeze it. The final irony is that Krishna's greatest lesson may be found in the limits of his own success. He could influence rulers, save a people, construct alliances, and guide a war, but he could not make human beings permanently wise. His legacy survives because the story refuses to pretend that politics has a perfect ending. The struggle between order and ambition continues after the strategist is gone. The master strategist who had reshaped empires, unified alliances, and guided the greatest war in history, died quietly in the wilderness, leaving behind a world permanently changed by his intellect. Epilogue: The legacy of the statesman. The life of Krishna leaves us with an enduring question that defies simple answers. Was he primarily a divine figure operating through the medium of history to fulfill a cosmic plan? Or can the Mahabharata be read as the story of an extraordinarily sophisticated human statesman operating within a broken political world? The Mahabharata deliberately leaves this tension unresolved. If we evaluate Krishna purely as a political mind, his career reveals a realistic truth about statecraft, that even the most brilliant strategy cannot guarantee permanent peace in a world driven by human pride, ambition, and greed. Krishna established the conditions for Pandava victory, saved his people from annihilation, and articulated a philosophy of duty and righteousness that has survived for millennia. But he could not alter human nature. Victory did not create an eternal utopia, it merely bought humanity another chance to rebuild. Perhaps his ultimate lesson as a statesman lies in his refusal to abandon the world. He did not retreat into moral withdrawal when confronted with corruption and chaos. He engaged directly with the world as he found it, imperfect, compromised, and violent, and fought tirelessly to bend the arc of history toward justice. In the final assessment, Krishna stands as a monumental figure of political history, a negotiator who pursued peace until the last option was gone, a strategist who understood that power without moral purpose is mere brutality, a leader who bore the painful moral weight of hard choices, and a statesman who understood that while empires rise and fall, the struggle for a balanced world never ends.